Hello, my name is David and I am the co-founder and CEO of Peergrade, and I'm here today to talk about peer feedback with Peergrade. So I normally say that this is me. Besides being the co-founder and CEO of Peergrade, I'm also a PhD student at the Technical University of Denmark. And a couple of years back, the class I was teaching, which is a data science class, suddenly went from 20 to 150 students. And with 150 students, we have almost 1,000 papers or pages to grade every single week. And 1,000 pages of papers to grade is completely incomprehensible, right? There's no way to do that in a meaningful way. So I went to all my colleagues and they said, oh, you should just do multiple choice exams. It's the best idea. You don't have to do anything. But the course I'm teaching has a lot of open-ended assignments and I really wanted to keep it that way. So we thought, okay, is there any other way we can keep the open-endedness of the assignments but still have students get some feedback? And we went to peer review as the pedagogical idea, but we weren't really satisfied with the systems in place to do it, so we built our own. And that's what's called Peergrade today. So I'll start talking about what peer feedback is as a pedagogical idea, and then I'll get back to Peergrade as a system later. So conceptually, peer feedback is rather simple. Students submit some kind of work. It could be a PDF report, it could be a video presentation, it could be anything you can imagine submitting to your teacher. And then instead of having the teacher give feedback, the students give feedback to each other. It normally happens anonymously, and then it also happens according to what we call a feedback rubric. So a feedback rubric is a set of guidelines that the teacher has created for helping students write great feedback. And then in the end, maybe the most important thing is that students work with this feedback. They can read it, they can react to it, they can criticize it, they can flag it for moderation and so on. So there's also a component after receiving the feedback. I talked about feedback rubrics and I just wanted to give an example of how such a rubric could look. So here is two questions. The first one is an evaluation question of some sort. It's called, did the submission include a good discussion? And you can pick there's no discussion, that's not good. You can pick that the discussion could be better, and then you have to explain what's lacking. Or you can say that the discussion was good, and you can explain what's good. So here you have something that both pushes students to provide some explanatory feedback, but also allows them to evaluate the quality. And then the other question here, find one or more paragraphs that you think works really well, and explain why it works well. And the cool thing about this question is that if you answer that question, it's very hard to answer that question without being specific, right? You can't say great language. You have to say where the language is great. So by using these feedback rubrics in a good way, teachers can help students write really good feedback. When I talk to people about peer feedback, I often find that they immediately start thinking, okay, so I have all these papers. I don't want to grade them. I'll have the students grade them instead. It's kind of a replacement of teachers. But that's not how we think about peer feedback. You can use it that way, but you can also use it in other ways. So some examples of how you can use peer feedback in a non-trivial way is, for example, what we call process writing. So the idea is that feedback is best if you get it before you actually submit your final work. So what many teachers do with Peergrade is that they allow the students to submit something, the students give feedback to each other, and then the students get that feedback to home, and then they revise their work and hand it in again in the final draft to the teacher. So that way the teacher doesn't have to give feedback twice to all the students, but they can actually still use feedback to improve. Another example is from a math class in Denmark. We had a teacher who wants the students to learn some proofs. And the way you normally do that is that you pick a random student from the class, you get them to go to the blackboard and try to do the proof on the blackboard. But it's really hard, it's really time-consuming for everybody, and there's only one guy who gets kicked out, so it's not going to be you, so you don't really prepare. So what this teacher does is that he asks every student to go together with another student, and then they all do the proof on a whiteboard somewhere, and then they videotape it with a smartphone and submit that to Peergrade. And that way, all students have to go to the blackboard, and that's actually the most important part here. And all students get looked at by somebody else, so they can't just goof off completely. And then the last example is from a history teacher who had this thing where a normal thing you do in history class is that you get some sources to read at home. You read them, you think about them, and then you prepare, and then you come to class on Monday, and then you discuss what you read in these texts. So the problem with that is that often students don't read, and then they come unprepared to class. So what this teacher did was that he asked the students to go home, read their sources, and then before coming to class, he would ask them to go to Peergrade, submit just 2 or 3 lines about what they think the sources mean, and then they read 2 other people's reflections about it. And then when they come to class on Monday, he knows that everybody has read, everybody has reflected on their own, and then that everybody has seen what other people have said. So when they start the class on Monday, everybody's already ready to discuss it at a higher level. So these are just different examples of how you can think of peer-to-peer feedback. It doesn't have to be grading of papers by students. Why do we use peer feedback? So there's a couple of different reasons. The most obvious one is that students can get a lot more feedback. When we look inside Peergrade, we can see that in a class, an average student receives more than 2 pages of feedback, 2 full pages. And that corresponds to what you see in the back here, which is the first chapter of Moby Dick. And this is of course just quantity, right? It's just a lot of words. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's high quality, but if a student receives 2 pages of feedback, somebody wrote those 2 pages. And having students write 2 pages of feedback is an extremely learning intensive process. So I think it's very rare that anybody gets 2 pages of feedback, so there's clearly a case for that just the amount of feedback in peer feedback is quite interesting. But the most important thing is of course that students learn a lot by participating in a peer feedback session. So I found this study by the Education Endowment Foundation, and they list a number of different studies that look into what methods for teaching and learning are the most effective. And the 3 that comes out on top are feedback, good old feedback, something called metacognition and self-regulation, and then peer tutoring. Metacognition is this idea about thinking about your own learning. What am I learning? How am I learning? Why am I learning? And so on. There's no peer feedback on the list, but if you combine these 3 things, you basically get students giving feedback to each other in order to learn some metacognition skills. So basically, the top 3 things in this list is what Peergrade or peer feedback consists of. A simpler version of this is the learning pyramid that many people love and hate, and everybody's discussing these percentages, so you can probably ignore them, but I think it's a pretty relatively well-established fact that you learn something from reading and listening, you learn more from doing, and one of the most, if not the most learning effective task is to teach other people. And giving feedback to others is a way of teaching in writing. So you learn the most from teaching, and that's very good, but why is it then the teachers that are teaching in all the classes and not the students? They're the ones who are supposed to be learning. Then there's also some different skills that you can help train with peer feedback. So one of them is critical thinking. This is something everybody talks about and nobody really seems to understand exactly what it is. But the funny thing is that when a teacher gives feedback to their students, the students just accept it. Students are very accepting towards the teacher's feedback. But if a student receives feedback from their fellow students, they generally do not accept it. They're very skeptical of their peers, at least in the beginning. And that's extremely good, because that means that the students will read the feedback thoroughly, they will counter-argue, they will criticize it, they will really think about it. And that's exactly where the learning happens. The learning doesn't happen by getting a lot of red marks on your paper and putting it down in your backpack. The learning happens when you interact with the feedback. When you give feedback, you learn to give feedback, and you learn to receive feedback. And this is a super important life skill that we want all students to learn. And you can't just take a class on feedback giving. The way to learn it is by doing it a lot and getting feedback on your feedback and so on. So peer feedback is obviously a good way to train that. And then the last idea is that by working with these feedback rubrics, you can train students in using the criteria that you use for assessing good work, right? So there's clearly things that an essay has to do to be a good essay. And if a student doesn't know that, it's very hard for them to create good essays. So by using rubrics, you can help the students understand these criteria and use them to self-assess when they're doing work on their own. So that was a little bit about what peer feedback is, and then I'll talk a little bit about how to do effective peer review in a classroom. So I have a few tips that I generally advise. The first one is that we always recommend that you use good feedback rubrics. I already talked a little bit about this and gave a few examples, but I'm going to give some more. So here's an example of another question with a scale in it. So the question is, how good is the project at using relevant tools, concepts, models, and theories to evaluate the project? And then in this case, there are 5 levels of completion. The worst is that no tools are used at all. That's not good at all. It's a little bit better if the students are using irrelevant tools. It's obviously not very good, but it's still better than not even attempting anything. It's of course better than that if you use the relevant tools. To be better than that, you need to use the relevant tools, but you also have to explain why they're relevant. And if you want to completely fulfill this criteria, you have to do all of that and conclude what you learn. This question, of course, is a lot of work to create. But the cool thing is that if you create a question like this, and the student selects option number 4, they know exactly what they did right, and the receiver knows exactly what they should do to improve. If you just have the top question and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it's very hard for a student to learn from getting a 4 and not a 5. But by actually putting some work into these rubric criteria, you can make it easy for the students to provide useful feedback. Some other examples of open-ended criteria are: find 3 places where the grammar is wrong, explain why it's wrong, and show how to do it correctly. In this case, it's not really a criteria, but it's more of a guide for the reviewer to give help to the receiver. So it's like a reading guide of some sort. And the other one is which relevant technical terms is used in the assignment. So now you have to think about what are terms, what are relevant terms, what are relevant technical terms, and then you have to spot them in the other person's assignment. And that's a really good learning exercise. Also for the original submitter, who now gets 3 different versions of this back by people spotting different terms in their paper. You can also be very self-reflective. So for example, if you had to go back and improve your submission right now after giving feedback, what would you change, right? So one of the things you realize after working with peer feedback is that most of the learning actually happens by giving feedback instead of receiving it. And especially that of reading another person's submission, critiquing it and giving it feedback, you learn a lot about your own work that way. It's also a possibility of having students empathize with other actors or people and say, imagine you're a film critic, for example. What would you review this movie to be? Imagine you're an investor. Would you invest in this business? Try to use kind of role-playing ideas to get students to see things from different angles. My final 2 examples is this idea of feedback, feed up, feed forward. So this question is, explain what the author is trying to do and are they successful? And this is a way to get students to write relevant feedback. Because if you force them to first say, okay, what are they even trying to achieve here? Then you don't, let's say it's an essay and the grammar isn't important, then you don't start giving feedback on the grammar, but you think, okay, the purpose of this assignment was this thing and that's what I'm supposed to help them with. And the last example is a classical lab report example, where you say, okay, does the lab report include all the sections that it's supposed to? It has to have an abstract, an introduction, materials, and so on. It makes it very clear and very easy for the students to figure out, are they introducing all the different parts that they need to have in their lab reports. So that was the first part. Use a good feedback rubric, and we have some material on our website to help you develop these. The next part is about anonymity. So when you look in Peergrade, you can see that 95% or more of all teachers run their peer feedback sessions anonymously. And in some way it would be nice if students were able to give feedback non-anonymously, but in many cases it's very hard for students, especially in smaller classrooms, to really be fair and frank with their classmates. This is especially hard for some of the better students actually, who they get a piece of work and they know it's not good, they know the quality is very low, but they have a very hard time telling that to somebody else because like what are they going to think of me and so on. So I would always advise to give feedback anonymously, and there's actually a lot of research showing that this is the way to get the best feedback in a peer feedback session. And then I think another important part is that if you tell your students, hey, we're going to do peer feedback, you're going to review each other's work, and I'm just going to go on vacation, they're probably not going to be very satisfied. They need to feel safe in a process that's relatively new to them. So I would always recommend that as a teacher you go in and you moderate and you look at the feedback and you help the students out so that they know that they're not getting left alone in this idea, but that the teacher is there to help them. And then my final advice is what we call reacting to feedback. So if I give feedback to somebody else, then you ask that somebody else to give feedback to the feedback. So I know, how was my feedback received? Did people like it? What could I do better? And it also means that you know somebody's actually reading your feedback, which makes it a more exciting exercise than to actually spend time on writing something for somebody else. The last part of my slides is about Peergrade as a system and how Peergrade can facilitate giving feedback to each other. So Peergrade works in the web browser on all devices and all browsers, and there's a bunch of interfaces for teachers where the teachers can get an overview, so they can see who's doing what feedback did this person give to that person, they can go and moderate the feedback and so on. And then there are some interfaces for students where they can submit their work from all sorts of formats, they can submit feedback, they can review the feedback and all these different things. And then I've taken a few features from Peergrade that I think are some of the more interesting ones and the non-obvious ones. So the first one, I already talked a bit about this idea of feedback reactions. So the idea is that if I give feedback to somebody, then they get a small rubric where they give feedback to my feedback. And this has a lot of effects, right? So I'll know somebody read my feedback, they will be able to react to my feedback in a meaningful way. And also as a teacher, you can then see, or at least get an insight into which students are actually providing great feedback, right? So we see many teachers using the feedback quality that students provide as a part of the assessment in their classes. So for example, you would have to provide good feedback to pass the class. That's one way people use it. In Peergrade you can support group work, so multiple students can submit work together without having to review their own work and in a way so that they can all see the results when it comes back and so forth. We also have this thing we call conversations, and the idea here is that sometimes students will write something that's not extremely clear and probably requires a follow-up question. So in Peergrade, if you give feedback to somebody, they can reply to that feedback in an instant messaging-like fashion and say, for example, you did not meet the requirements, and then you can ask, can you specify which requirement I failed to meet? So we don't think feedback should stop at the receiver. It should be a discussion and a conversation instead, which is where the real pedagogical benefits lie. In Peergrade, it's very easy to allow students to self-evaluate, and self-assessment, self-feedback is research-wise proven to be extremely effective. It's what you learn the most from by reading your own work and reflecting about your mistakes. And in Peergrade it works that way that you get the self-evaluation after you finish your peer review. So first you review others' work and then you review your own. And then you start seeing some things in your own work that you didn't see otherwise. As I already mentioned a little bit, you can submit anything in Peergrade. So any type of file, video, sound, we have people submitting podcasts about the history of the universe, we have people submitting videos of volleyball practice. Anything you can imagine, you can submit it to Peergrade. I already talked a bit about anonymity as well. So Peergrade is by default anonymous both ways, but you can also disable anonymity in either way. So you can have people know who they're reviewing, but not know who the feedback is coming from, for example. And of course, the anonymity is between the students. As a teacher, you can always see which students are which. One of the things that happens behind the scenes in Peergrade and in peer review is who should actually be giving feedback to who. There's easy ways to solve this, and then there's more complex ways to solve this. And we've tried to really do it properly. So in Peergrade, we automatically learn the quality of the feedback from each student. So we can say, okay, we don't want to have a situation where one submission gets feedback from all bad reviewers. So by having these statistical models in Peergrade learn how good each student is at giving feedback, we can actually balance it out so that everybody receives high quality feedback at the same time. And that all happens behind the scenes. The teachers don't have to do anything, it just happens automatically. And then the final thing I want to talk about is what we call flagging. So a flag is something a student can raise when they get feedback that they disagree with or that they think the teacher should go and moderate. So let's say you get some feedback that's incorrect. You can flag it for moderation, you can write why you disagree, and then the teacher can go in and overrule the evaluation. They can follow up with their own feedback, and they can kind of, I guess, make sure that the whole situation is good. And this is something that also really helps students feel safe in the process of peer feedback. So this is what I wanted to tell about Peergrade. And then the last important thing to say is that you should of course go and try it yourself. So I have this code presentation. So if you go to peergrade.io, sign up and use the code presentation, then you'll get 3 months free of the pro plan of Peergrade. But there's also a free version of Peergrade that's available forever to all teachers, so you can also work with that. But if you want to try out all the different things, you can use this code if you want to. Thanks a lot for coming. Thanks.